Marcus Johnson was a man who loved simplicity. At 32 years old, he had built a life filled with purpose and meaning. He worked as an IT specialist during the day, fixing computers and solving technical problems for people in his community. But when evening fell, Marcus cherished the quiet moments he spent walking through his neighborhood. It wasn't just exercise. It was his way of unwinding after long days juggling work and family responsibilities. Every step gave him time to think, breathe, and appreciate the small joys of life. On this particular evening, Marcus decided to take his usual route. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets. The air carried a gentle breeze, cool enough to make the walk pleasant, but warm enough to remind everyone that summer was still holding on. Marcus slipped into his favorite pair of athletic shorts and sneakers, grabbed his keys, and headed out the door. His wife, Elena, called after him, reminding him not to stay out too late. "Don't worry," he said with a smile before stepping outside. The neighborhood was peaceful, almost idyllic. Children played tag on front lawns while parents watched from porch chairs, sipping lemonade or chatting about their days. Marcus waved at familiar faces as he passed by. Neighbors knew him well. He was always friendly, stopping occasionally to compliment someone's garden or ask how they were doing. To them, Marcus was just another face in the crowd, someone who belonged there like anyone else. But unbeknownst to Marcus, things were about to change. A few blocks away, Officer Greg Peterson sat in his patrol car, scanning the area lazily. Peterson had been on the force for over 15 years, and though he once dreamed of making a difference, those aspirations had faded over time. Now he often found himself bored during shifts, looking for anything to break the monotony. That's when he noticed Marcus. Peterson squinted through the windshield, watching Marcus stroll down the sidewalk. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about him, just a man taking a walk. But something about Marcus caught Peterson's attention. Maybe it was the way he moved, or maybe it was the color of his skin. Whatever it was, Peterson felt uneasy. In his mind, Marcus didn't look like he belonged in this part of town. This wasn't based on facts. It was purely instinct, or rather prejudice disguised as intuition. Peterson leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. He picked up his radio and called dispatch. "I've got a suspicious individual walking near Maple Street," he said, his tone casual but firm. "Male, early 30s, wearing dark clothing, requesting backup." As soon as the words left his mouth, Peterson regretted them, not because he doubted his decision, but because he knew deep down that what he was doing wasn't right. Still, he told himself it was better to err on the side of caution. After all, hadn't he heard reports of burglaries in nearby neighborhoods? And didn't criminals sometimes blend in, pretending to be ordinary citizens? Minutes later, another patrol car arrived, its flashing lights cutting through the calm evening air. Marcus didn't notice at first. He was lost in thought, replaying snippets of conversations from earlier in the day and planning what chores needed to be done around the house. When he finally looked up, however, his heart skipped a beat. 2 police cars were parked haphazardly ahead of him, blocking his path. Officers stepped out, their movements brisk and deliberate. They approached him quickly, hands resting on their holstered weapons. "Sir," one of them shouted, "stop right there." Marcus froze, confused. What was happening? Had he done something wrong? His mind raced as he raised his hands slowly, palms facing outward. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. Officer Peterson stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You match the description of a suspect we're looking for," he said gruffly. "We need you to cooperate." "A suspect?" Marcus repeated, incredulous. "For what?" Before Peterson could respond, another officer chimed in. "Keep your hands where we can see them," he barked. "Don't move." Marcus did as he was told, standing perfectly still as adrenaline coursed through his veins. His mind scrambled to make sense of the situation. Was this some kind of misunderstanding? Or was it something more sinister? All he'd done was take a walk, a simple, harmless act. Yet here he was, surrounded by armed officers treating him like a criminal. As the seconds ticked by, tension mounted. The officers' voices grew louder, overlapping each other until Marcus could barely understand what they were saying. One of them mentioned seeing something shiny in Marcus's pocket, a supposed weapon. Panic surged within him. Shiny? Weapon? No, it couldn't be. He reached instinctively toward his pocket, intending to pull out his keys and show them he wasn't dangerous. But the movement was misinterpreted. "Don't reach for it," someone yelled. Marcus froze again, his breath hitching. "It's just my keys," he stammered. "Please let me show you." But it was too late. Fear had taken hold, clouding judgment and escalating the situation beyond control. What started as a routine walk had spiraled into something far more serious, and Marcus realized with growing dread that he might not emerge unscathed. As the officers surrounded Marcus, their voices grew louder and more urgent. The calm evening air that had once been filled with the sounds of children laughing and leaves rustling was now overtaken by shouts and commands. Marcus stood frozen, his hands raised high above his head, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his ears. Each breath came shallow and quick, his chest tightening as fear gripped him like a vice. He tried to speak again to explain himself, but the words caught in his throat. "Don't move," one officer barked, stepping closer. His hand hovered near the holster of his gun, his eyes darting between Marcus's face and his pockets. "We said keep your hands where we can see them." Marcus swallowed hard, his voice trembling. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he managed to say. "I live around here, I was just taking a walk." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Officer Peterson, who had initiated the confrontation, stepped forward, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. "You match the description of a suspect," he repeated, his tone clipped. "We've had reports of break-ins nearby. Now stay still while we sort this out." Marcus blinked, trying to process what was happening. Break-ins? Suspect? None of it made sense. He lived in this neighborhood. He knew these streets like the back of his hand. He'd waved at neighbors earlier, joked with kids playing basketball in driveways. How could they think he was involved in something criminal? The other officers began circling him, their boots crunching against the pavement. One of them pointed at Marcus's pocket. "What's that shiny thing?" he demanded. "Is that a weapon?" Marcus's mind raced. Shiny thing? Weapon? No, it couldn't be. He glanced down instinctively, realizing they were talking about his house keys. They must have caught the light when he moved his arm earlier. "It's just my keys," he said quickly, his voice rising in desperation. "Look, I'll show you. It's nothing. Please let me." Before he could finish, another officer shouted, "Don't reach for it!" Marcus stopped mid-motion, his fingers inches away from his pocket. His whole body tensed as he realized how dangerous this situation had become. Every movement he made seemed to provoke them further. His palms were slick with sweat and his legs felt weak beneath him. For a moment, all he could hear was the sound of his own breathing, ragged and uneven. Officer Peterson stepped even closer, his hand now firmly resting on the grip of his firearm. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice low and sharp. "If you're innocent, you've got nothing to worry about. Just do exactly what we tell you and no one gets hurt." Marcus nodded frantically, tears welling up in his eyes. Okay, he whispered. "I'm doing what you're saying, I'm not resisting." But despite his cooperation, the tension only grew thicker. Another officer muttered something about calling for backup, his radio crackling as he relayed the request. Within moments, 2 more patrol cars arrived, their flashing red and blue lights bathing the scene in an eerie glow. Neighbors began to gather on their porches and sidewalks, curious and alarmed by the commotion. Some pulled out their phones to record the unfolding drama, while others held their children close, shielding them from the sight. As the crowd grew, so did the pressure on the officers. Their movements became more frantic, their voices sharper. One of them, a younger man with a nervous twitch in his jaw, kept glancing at Peterson, clearly unsure of what to do next. Peterson, meanwhile, seemed determined to maintain control, barking orders and pacing back and forth like a predator stalking its prey. Then, without warning, everything escalated. Marcus shifted slightly, trying to ease the cramp forming in his arms from holding them aloft for so long. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it was enough to set off alarm bells in the minds of the officers. He's reaching for something, someone yelled. No, I'm not, Marcus cried, panic surging through him. I swear I'm not. But the damage was done. In the blink of an eye, one of the officers drew his weapon and fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the neighborhood, shattering the fragile calm that had lingered until now. Marcus staggered backward, clutching his side as searing pain exploded through his body. His knees buckled and he collapsed onto the cold pavement, gasping for air. Time seemed to slow down. The world around Marcus blurred into a haze of colors and sounds. He could hear shouting, both from the officers and from the growing crowd of onlookers, but the words didn't register. All he could focus on was the unbearable pain radiating from his wound and the warm wetness spreading across his shirt. He looked down, his vision swimming, and saw blood pooling beneath him. Oh my God, one of the officers muttered, his voice shaking. What have we done? Peterson rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside Marcus. For the first time since the confrontation began, his mask of authority cracked. His face paled, and his hands trembled as he reached for Marcus. Stay with me, he pleaded, his voice breaking. Please don't pass out, help is coming. Marcus stared up at him, his eyes wide with shock and confusion. Why was this man suddenly so desperate? Moments ago he had been treated like a criminal, accused of crimes he hadn't committed. Now, here he was, bleeding on the ground with Peterson hovering over him like a man possessed. Why? Marcus croaked, his voice barely audible. Why did you? Peterson cut him off, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, he choked out. I'm so sorry. This wasn't supposed to happen. You weren't supposed to get hurt. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Marcus, though his thoughts were clouded by pain and disbelief. Here was the same man who had profiled him, who had escalated the situation beyond reason, now begging for forgiveness. But the apology felt hollow, meaningless in the face of what had just occurred. As sirens wailed in the distance, signaling the arrival of paramedics, Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness. He caught glimpses of the chaos around him, the officers arguing among themselves, the horrified expressions of neighbors watching from afar, the flashing lights reflecting off windows. Somewhere deep inside, he wondered if he would survive this ordeal, and if he did, what kind of life would await him afterward. For now, all he could do was lie there, fighting to stay awake as the world spun around him. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, cutting through the chaos like a knife. Paramedics arrived in a blur of motion, their faces tense with urgency as they pushed past the officers and dropped to their knees beside Marcus. One of them immediately pressed a thick gauze pad against his wound, trying to stop the bleeding, while another checked his pulse and spoke to him in calm but firm tones. Stay with us, sir, the paramedic urged, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. You're going to be okay. Just focus on my voice. Marcus tried to nod, but even that small movement sent waves of pain shooting through his body. His vision blurred and he struggled to keep his eyes open. The world around him felt distant, as if he were watching everything unfold from far away. He could hear muffled voices, some frantic, others pleading, but none of it made sense anymore. All he wanted was for the pain to stop. Officer Peterson remained crouched beside Marcus, his face pale and streaked with tears. He had never imagined things would spiral this far out of control. In his years on the force, he had always prided himself on being tough, unshakable. But now, confronted with the reality of what he had helped set into motion, he felt utterly broken. His hands trembled as he reached out again, hovering over Marcus without touching him, unsure of what to do or say. I'm sorry, Peterson whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of guilt. I didn't mean for this to happen. Please forgive me. Marcus blinked slowly, his gaze locking onto Peterson's face. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but also something else. Anger, confusion, disbelief. How could this man expect forgiveness after everything? Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he let out a weak groan, his body convulsing slightly as another wave of pain hit him. The other officers stood frozen, some staring at the ground while others exchanged uneasy glances. They knew they were in trouble, not just legally but morally. This wasn't how police work was supposed to go. Their job was to protect and serve. Yet here they were, responsible for putting an innocent man's life in jeopardy. The younger officer who had fired the shot looked visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he holstered his weapon. He glanced at Peterson, searching for guidance but found none. Peterson was too consumed by his own remorse to offer any leadership. As the paramedics worked to stabilize Marcus, neighbors began to gather closer, their phones held high to capture the scene. Some recorded silently, their expressions grim, while others shouted questions at the officers. "What happened?" one woman demanded, her voice rising above the din. "Why did you shoot him? He wasn't doing anything wrong." Peterson flinched at the accusation, lowering his head in shame. He wanted to explain, to defend his actions, but the words caught in his throat. How could he justify what had happened when he barely understood it himself? He had acted on instinct, driven by biases he hadn't even realized he harbored until now. And now, because of those biases, a man lay bleeding on the pavement, fighting for his life. One of the older neighbors, a man named Mr. Thompson, stepped forward, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "This is Marcus Johnson," he said loudly, pointing at the injured man. "He lives 3 blocks down. He's been walking these streets every evening for years. You think he's a burglar?" "Are you serious?" The crowd murmured in agreement, their anger growing palpable. A few people began chanting, their voices rising in unison. "No justice, no peace." Others clapped rhythmically, amplifying the message. The officers shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how outnumbered they were. For the first time they realized the depth of the community's outrage, and how quickly it could escalate. Back on the ground, Marcus's breathing grew, shallower. The paramedics worked tirelessly, strapping an oxygen mask over his face and preparing to lift him onto a stretcher. As they moved him, Marcus caught sight of Elena standing at the edge of the crowd, her hands clasped over her mouth in horror. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Marcus saw the fear etched into her features. She had brought their children along, hoping to catch him during his walk, only to witness this nightmare instead. Elena rushed forward, pushing past bystanders until she reached the paramedics. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Please tell me he's going to be okay." "We're doing everything we can, ma'am," one of the paramedics replied gently. "We need to get him to the hospital right away." Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face as she turned to glare at the officers. "How could you do this?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "He was just taking a walk. He hasn't done anything wrong." Her words hung heavy in the air, silencing the crowd for a brief moment. Even the officers seemed unable to respond, their faces etched with guilt and shame. Peterson, still kneeling near Marcus, lowered his head further, unable to meet Elena's gaze. He had seen countless victims' families over the years, but this was different. This time he was directly responsible. Finally, the paramedics loaded Marcus onto the ambulance and sped away, sirens blaring. The crowd lingered, their anger simmering just below the surface. Some continued recording videos, vowing to share them online to hold the officers accountable. Others gathered in small groups discussing what had happened and planning protests. It was clear that this incident wouldn't be forgotten anytime soon. As the commotion died down, Peterson finally rose to his feet, his legs shaky beneath him. He wiped his face with trembling hands, smearing dirt and tears across his cheeks. The other officers avoided looking at him, knowing that his actions, or lack thereof, had contributed to the disaster. Peterson knew he couldn't undo what had happened, but he also knew he couldn't run away from it either. He had to face the consequences, no matter how painful they might be. For the rest of the night, the neighborhood buzzed with activity. News outlets arrived to cover the story, interviewing witnesses and gathering footage. Social media lit up with posts about the shooting, many calling for justice and accountability. Hashtags like #Justice for Marcus trended locally, drawing attention not only to this specific incident, but also to broader issues of racial profiling and police brutality. Meanwhile, Peterson returned to the station, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. He knew an internal investigation would follow, along with public scrutiny and potential criminal charges. But beyond that, he couldn't shake the image of Marcus lying on the ground, bleeding and broken, whispering, "Why?" in a voice filled with pain and betrayal. That question haunted him, echoing in his mind long after the sirens faded and the crowd dispersed. Peterson sat alone in the locker room, staring blankly at the wall. For the first time in his career, he questioned whether he truly belonged in law enforcement. Had he been blinded by prejudice? Was he capable of change? Or was the damage already done? These questions weighed heavily on him, leaving him feeling lost and overwhelmed. Little did he know the hardest part was yet to come. The days following the shooting were a whirlwind of emotions, investigations, and public outcry. News of the incident spread like wildfire, dominating headlines not just locally, but across the country. The video footage captured by neighbors painted a damning picture. Marcus Johnson, an unarmed black man simply taking his evening walk, confronted by officers who escalated the situation without cause. The images of Peterson kneeling beside Marcus, tears streaming down his face, became symbolic of the chaos and regret that followed. For Marcus's family, life had been turned upside down. Elena spent countless hours at the hospital, sitting by her husband's bedside as he fought for his life in the ICU. The bullet had struck him in the abdomen, causing severe internal injuries. Surgeons worked tirelessly to repair the damage, but the road to recovery would be long and uncertain. Doctors warned Elena that even if Marcus survived, he might never fully regain his strength or independence. The thought weighed heavily on her, filling her with anger and despair. At home, their two children, 8-year-old Mia and 6-year-old Jordan, struggled to understand what had happened. Elena tried to shield them from the harsh reality, telling them that Daddy was very sick and needed time to get better. But the absence of their father was undeniable. The house felt quieter, emptier. Mia often cried herself to sleep, clutching one of Marcus's old t-shirts for comfort. Jordan, too young to fully grasp the situation, kept asking when they could go visit him. Each question broke Elena's heart a little more. Meanwhile, protests erupted throughout the city. Community leaders organized marches, demanding accountability for the officers involved. Signs reading "Justice for Marcus" and "End Police Brutality" filled the streets, while chants echoed through neighborhoods. People from all walks of life joined the demonstrations, united in their outrage over yet another senseless act of violence against a black person. Social media played a crucial role, amplifying voices and spreading awareness far beyond the local community. Back at the police station, Officer Greg Peterson found himself ostracized by his colleagues. Once respected, or at least tolerated, for his years of service, he was now viewed as a liability. His fellow officers avoided eye contact with him, whispering behind closed doors about how his actions had brought shame upon the department. Some blamed him entirely for the escalation, while others defended him, arguing that the younger officer who fired the shot bore equal responsibility. Either way, Peterson knew he was at the center of the storm. Peterson's guilt consumed him. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Marcus lying on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. The sound of the gunshot replayed in his mind over and over again, each echo louder and more haunting than the last. He began drinking heavily, hoping alcohol would dull the pain, but it only made things worse. His wife Lisa begged him to seek help, but Peterson resisted. He didn't feel worthy of forgiveness, not from Marcus, not from Elena, and certainly not from himself. Eventually, Peterson realized he couldn't keep running from the truth. Against his instincts, he agreed to attend counseling sessions arranged by the department. At first, he sat silently during these meetings, refusing to engage with the therapist or share his thoughts. But slowly, he began opening up, admitting things he had buried deep inside for years. He talked about growing up in a predominantly white neighborhood, where casual racism was normalized. He confessed to harboring stereotypes about black men, though he had always told himself he wasn't prejudiced. And he acknowledged that his assumptions about Marcus, that he didn't belong in the neighborhood, had been rooted in bias rather than fact. The therapy sessions forced Peterson to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, but they also gave him a glimmer of hope. For the first time, he understood why people were so angry, not just at him, but at a system that allowed incidents like this to happen repeatedly. He began attending community meetings organized by activists, listening to stories from families who had lost loved ones to police violence. These experiences were humbling, often leaving him in tears as he grappled with the enormity of the harm caused by individuals like himself. Despite his efforts to make amends, Peterson faced intense backlash. Many viewed his attempts at redemption as insincere, believing that apologies couldn't undo the damage done. Protesters held signs calling for his immediate termination, while online petitions demanding criminal charges against him gained thousands of signatures. Even some of the counselors he worked with expressed skepticism, wondering whether his newfound remorse was genuine or merely a calculated attempt to save his career. As the investigation into the shooting progressed, details emerged that painted a clearer picture of what had gone wrong. Body cam footage revealed inconsistencies in the officers' accounts of the incident. While Peterson claimed he had acted out of concern for public safety, the video showed no evidence to support his claims. Instead, it highlighted moments of aggression and poor judgment, particularly from the younger officer who fired the fatal shot. Internal Affairs recommended disciplinary action against all officers present, including Peterson, who was stripped of his badge and placed on administrative leave pending further review. For Marcus, the physical toll of the shooting was matched only by its emotional impact. After weeks in the hospital, he was finally released, though his recovery was far from complete. Walking required the use of crutches, and simple tasks like tying his shoes left him exhausted. Pain medication helped manage the discomfort, but it couldn't erase the trauma of that night. Nightmares plagued him, waking him in cold sweats as memories of the confrontation flooded back. He struggled to adjust to a new normal, one where trust felt impossible to rebuild. Elena became both caregiver and advocate, juggling her responsibilities at home with her determination to seek justice. She joined forces with local organizations, fighting against systemic racism and police brutality, using her story to raise awareness and push for policy changes. Her courage inspired many, earning her praise from activists and community members alike. Yet beneath her strong exterior, she carried a heavy burden. The image of Marcus bleeding on the pavement haunted her, a reminder of how close she came to losing him forever. As months passed, the case went to trial. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and supporters on both sides. Testimonies from witnesses, experts, and the officers themselves painted a complex narrative, leaving jurors with difficult decisions to make. Peterson took the stand, his voice trembling as he recounted the events of that fateful night. He admitted his mistakes, apologized publicly to Marcus and his family, and vowed to dedicate the rest of his life to making amends. But even as he spoke, he knew words alone wouldn't be enough. When the verdict was announced, it sparked mixed reactions. The younger officer who fired the shot was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to several years in prison. Peterson and the other officers received lesser punishments, including probation and mandatory counseling. To some, the sentences felt inadequate given the severity of the crime. To others, they represented a step toward accountability. Yet for Marcus and his family, justice remained elusive. No punishment could undo the trauma they endured or restore the life they once had. As they looked toward the future, they knew the scars, both visible and invisible, would linger for years to come. Months after the trial ended, life began to settle into a fragile rhythm for everyone involved. The headlines faded from the front pages, replaced by newer stories that demanded attention. Yet, the ripple effects of that fateful night continued to shape lives in profound and lasting ways. For Marcus Johnson, Elena, their children, Officer Greg Peterson, and the broader community, closure remained an elusive concept, a distant horizon they could see but never quite reach. For Marcus, each day was a battle against pain, frustration, and lingering fear. Physically, he was improving, though progress came in small, agonizing increments. He attended physical therapy sessions 3 times a week, working tirelessly to regain strength in his legs and core. At first, even standing for more than a few minutes left him breathless. But with determination and countless hours spent pushing through discomfort, he eventually learned to walk without crutches. Still, the scars on his body served as constant reminders of what he had endured. Every twinge of pain brought back memories of the shooting, forcing him to relive those terrifying moments over and over again. Emotionally, the wounds ran deeper. Marcus found himself grappling with anger, not just toward the officers who had hurt him, but also toward a society that allowed such injustices to persist. He wrestled with feelings of betrayal, wondering how anyone could look at him, a husband, a father, a neighbor, and see a threat. These thoughts often kept him awake, at night staring at the ceiling while Elena slept beside him. Despite her unwavering support, Marcus sometimes felt isolated, as if no one truly understood the weight he carried. Elena, too, bore the burden of trauma. While she focused outwardly on advocating for change, inwardly she struggled with anxiety and guilt. She blamed herself for letting Marcus take that walk alone, even though logically she knew it wasn't her fault. What if she had insisted he stay home? What if she had gone with him? These what-ifs haunted her, replaying endlessly in her mind. To cope, she threw herself into activism, organizing rallies, speaking at events, and collaborating with organizations dedicated to ending police brutality. Her work gave her purpose, but it also reminded her daily of the fragility of life and the systemic issues that still needed addressing. Their children, Mia and Jordan, adapted differently to the changes in their family dynamic. Mia grew quieter, retreating into books and schoolwork as a way to process her emotions. When asked about her dad, she would smile bravely and say, "He's getting better," though her eyes betrayed the sadness she felt. Jordan, being younger, expressed his feelings more openly. He often asked when Daddy would play catch with him again or why people were so mad all the time. His innocence tugged at Elena's heartstrings, making her wish desperately for a world where children didn't have to grow up asking such questions. Meanwhile, Officer Greg Peterson found himself navigating uncharted territory. Stripped of his badge and ostracized by former colleagues, he retreated from public life, living in self-imposed isolation. Friends stopped calling, and acquaintances avoided him at grocery stores, leaving him feeling like a ghost in his own community. His marriage suffered under the strain. Lisa, once supportive, grew weary of his moods and drinking binges. Eventually, she moved out, taking their teenage son with her. Peterson couldn't blame her. He barely recognized the man he had become. Determined to salvage something from the wreckage of his life, Peterson committed himself fully to volunteering with grassroots organizations focused on racial justice. He attended workshops, participated in panel discussions, and even spoke at schools about the dangers of unchecked bias. Though his presence was met with skepticism, some refused to shake his hand or listen to his story, he persisted, driven by a desperate need to make amends. Over time, he earned the trust of a few individuals who saw his sincerity and appreciated his willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Peterson's journey was far from easy. There were days when old habits resurfaced, moments when he caught himself slipping back into defensive patterns. But he worked hard to remain mindful, challenging his assumptions and actively listening to those around him. Slowly, he began to understand the depth of the harm caused not only by his actions, but also by the systems he had once sworn to uphold. It was humbling and painful, but it opened his eyes to possibilities for real change. In the wider community, conversations sparked by Marcus's case continued to gain momentum. Activists pushed for reforms, including mandatory de-escalation training for law enforcement, stricter accountability measures, and increased transparency in investigations. Some victories were achieved. Local lawmakers passed legislation requiring body cameras for all officers, and independent oversight boards were established to review complaints of misconduct. However, many acknowledged that these steps were just the beginning. True transformation would require sustained effort, commitment, and courage from everyone. As months turned into years, Marcus emerged as a reluctant symbol of resilience. Though he preferred to avoid the spotlight, he agreed to share his story publicly because he believed it could inspire others. In interviews, he spoke candidly about his struggles and triumphs, urging listeners to channel their pain into action. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I did," he said during one televised appearance. "But if my experience can help create a safer, fairer world for our kids, then maybe it won't have been in vain." His words resonated deeply, particularly within communities of color that had long borne the brunt of systemic inequality. People admired Marcus not just for surviving, but for refusing to let bitterness consume him. Instead, he channeled his energy into building bridges, fostering dialogue, and advocating for meaningful reform. Alongside Elena, he co-founded a nonprofit organization aimed at educating young people about civic engagement and leadership. Through workshops, mentorship programs, and community events, they sought to empower the next generation to challenge injustice wherever they encountered it. Yet, despite the progress made, shadows lingered. Marcus occasionally caught glimpses of patrol cars driving through his neighborhood and felt a pang of unease. Trust, once broken, proved difficult to rebuild, not just between citizens and law enforcement, but within families, friendships, and institutions. Even acts of kindness or solidarity sometimes felt tinged with uncertainty, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. For Peterson, redemption remained an unfinished project. While some praised his efforts to atone, others dismissed them as insufficient. He accepted this reality, knowing he might never earn universal forgiveness, but he clung to hope that perhaps in time his contributions would outweigh his mistakes. On quiet evenings, he sat alone in his modest apartment, reflecting on how much he had lost and gained. He thought about Marcus, whose strength and grace inspired him to keep moving forward, even when the path seemed impossibly steep. The story of Marcus Johnson and Greg Peterson didn't end neatly wrapped in resolution. It was messy, complicated, and ongoing, a reflection of the larger societal struggles surrounding race, power, and accountability. As Marcus watched his children grow older, he wondered whether the world would be kinder to them than it had been to him. And as Peterson looked toward the future, he hoped his efforts might contribute, however imperfectly, to creating a better tomorrow. Ultimately, the legacy of that tragic evening rested not in its horrors, but in the choices people made afterward. Would they allow fear and division to define them, or would they strive for understanding and unity? The answer lay not in grand gestures, but in small, everyday actions: the courage to speak up, the willingness to listen, and the determination to build a world where no one had to endure what Marcus did. It was a daunting task, but one worth pursuing, step by painful step.